The janitor's mop glided across the polished floor of Westridge University's mathematics building, leaving behind a gleaming trail that reflected the fluorescent lights overhead. Marcus Johnson worked methodically, his movements precise and efficient after 15 years on the job. The hallway was empty now, the last class having ended an hour ago, but light still spilled from beneath the door of room 307, where Professor Richard Harlow's advanced calculus study group met every Wednesday evening. As Marcus approached the door, he could hear the animated voices of students engaged in heated debate over some mathematical conundrum. He smiled to himself, remembering a time when such discussions had filled him with a different kind of excitement than most people would understand. He paused outside the door, mop in hand, listening to the passionate exchange. "That's not right, Evan. You're confusing the chain rule with implicit differentiation," a female voice argued. "I'm not confused about anything, Sophie," a male voice shot back defensively. "I'm just saying there's a more elegant approach than what Professor Harlow showed us." Marcus chuckled quietly. Young minds, so eager to prove themselves, so convinced of their own brilliance. He'd seen generations of them come and go through these halls, some genuinely gifted, others merely pretending to understand concepts that were beyond their grasp. After a moment's hesitation, he pushed the door open and entered the room. The conversation died immediately. 6 pairs of eyes turned to look at him. 5 students and Professor Harlow, all seated around a large table covered with papers, textbooks, and laptops. Marcus nodded politely and moved to the corner where the trash can sat overflowing with crumpled papers and empty coffee cups. "Don't mind me," he said with a genial smile. "Just need to empty the trash. You all keep working." Professor Harlow, a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and perpetually disheveled hair, nodded absently. "Of course, Marcus. We'll try not to get in your way." Marcus appreciated that Harlow at least knew his name. Many professors looked right through him as if a man in a janitor's uniform was somehow invisible. He went about his work quietly, emptying the trash and wiping down the whiteboard while the study group returned to their heated discussion. "The problem is unsolvable as stated," insisted a young man with carefully styled hair and an expensive watch. "Evan," Marcus presumed from the earlier conversation. "We need more constraints or a different approach entirely." Professor Harlow sighed, removing his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose. "That's precisely the point of this exercise, Mr. Patterson. Not every problem presents itself with a clear path to solution. Sometimes you need to reframe your thinking." Marcus glanced at the whiteboard as he cleaned it, careful to leave untouched the complex equation that sprawled across the right side. His eyes lingered on the problem, a series of nested integrals with multiple variables and constraints. Something stirred in his mind, a familiar rhythm of thought that he hadn't indulged in quite some time. "It's a waste of time," Evan muttered, just loud enough for everyone to hear. "No one's going to solve this tonight." "With that attitude, certainly not," Sophie retorted. She was a young black woman with her hair pulled back in a neat bun, intense concentration in her eyes as she scribbled calculations in her notebook. Marcus finished with the trash and was about to leave when Evan's gaze fell on him. Something shifted in the young man's expression, a gleam of malice disguised as humor. "Hey!" Evan called out, stopping Marcus at the door. "What do you think of this problem, Janitor?" The room fell silent again. Professor Harlow frowned. "Mr. Patterson, that's inappropriate." "What?" Evan's face was the picture of mock innocence. "I'm just curious what an outside perspective might offer. Sometimes fresh eyes see what experts miss, right?" Marcus turned slowly, his expression neutral despite the familiar sting of being reduced to his job title. He'd faced worse over the years, much worse. This privileged kid with his snide remarks barely registered on his scale of indignities. "Evan, stop being a jerk," Sophie said sharply, But Evan was on a roll now, playing to his audience. Come on, it's just a bit of fun. Hey, janitor, there's $20 in it for you if you can even tell us what this equation is about. Marcus looked at the young man for a long moment, then at Professor Harlow, who appeared deeply uncomfortable but unsure how to diffuse the situation. The other students shifted awkwardly in their seats, some embarrassed, others secretly amused. Mr. Patterson, that's enough, Harlow said firmly. Apologize to Mr. Johnson immediately. But before Evan could respond, Marcus spoke. No need for apologies, Professor. I don't mind taking a look. He set down his cleaning supplies and approached the whiteboard, aware of the surprise on every face. The room had gone completely still as Marcus studied the equation, his eyes moving methodically across the variables and symbols. It had been years since he'd tackled anything this complex, but the familiar patterns emerged in his mind like old friends returning after a long absence. This is a variational calculus problem, Marcus said after a moment, his voice quiet but confident. You're looking for a function that minimizes that integral while satisfying those constraints. The stunned silence that followed was broken by Evan's dismissive laugh. Okay, so you can read the problem statement. That doesn't mean... The approach you're taking is overly complicated, Marcus continued, ignoring the interruption. You're trying to solve it directly using Euler-Lagrange equations, but there's a symmetry here you're not exploiting. Professor Harlow's eyebrows shot up. What kind of symmetry, Mr. Johnson? Marcus hesitated, suddenly aware of how far he'd already stepped outside the role everyone expected him to play. For 15 years, he'd been careful to keep this part of himself hidden, to be just Marcus the janitor, reliable and invisible. But something about the smug certainty in Evan's face made him continue. Cylindrical symmetry, he replied. If you transform to cylindrical coordinates, the problem simplifies considerably. He reached for a marker, then stopped, looking to Harlow for permission. The professor nodded, his expression a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Marcus uncapped the marker and began writing, his hand moving with surprising fluidity across the board. Equations flowed from his fingers as naturally as breathing, a transformation of variables followed by a series of clever substitutions that reduced the intimidating problem to something far more manageable. No one spoke as he worked. The only sound was the squeak of the marker against the whiteboard and the soft scratching of Sophie's pen as she frantically copied down what Marcus was writing. After about 5 minutes, he stepped back from the board. From here you can use standard techniques, he concluded, recapping the marker. The solution should be straightforward. Professor Harlow stared at the board, then at Marcus, his mouth slightly open. The students were frozen in various states of shock. Evan's face had drained of color, his earlier confidence replaced by confusion and disbelief. That's brilliant, Harlow finally managed. The cylindrical transformation. I should have seen it. Who are you? Sophie asked, her voice filled with wonder. Marcus gave a small, sad smile. Just the janitor, ma'am. If you'll excuse me, I have the rest of my rounds to finish. He gathered his cleaning supplies and headed for the door, leaving the room in stunned silence behind him. As he resumed his mopping in the hallway, he could hear the excited voices erupting from room 307, questions and exclamations tumbling over each other. Professor Harlow appeared in the doorway a moment later, his eyes searching Marcus's face with new interest. Mr. Johnson, could I have a word with you? Marcus nodded, leaning his mop against the wall. Yes, Professor. That was extraordinary, Harlow said, his voice low. Where did you learn to do that? Marcus hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. After 15 years of keeping his past tucked away, the instinct to deflect was strong, but there was genuine curiosity in Harlow's eyes, not judgment or disbelief. I studied mathematics in another life, he finally said, before I became a janitor. Studied it where? At what level? Harlow pressed, his academic curiosity overriding social niceties. Marcus took a deep breath. I was at MIT, doctoral program in applied mathematics, specializing in partial differential equations and variational methods. Harlow's eyes widened. You have a PhD from MIT, and you're working as... I don't have the degree, Marcus interrupted, his voice taking on an edge. I never finished. Life happened, Professor. Life happens to everyone, but it happens differently depending on who you are and where you come from. The vague answer seemed to satisfy Harlow for the moment, though Marcus could see the questions multiplying behind the professor's eyes. Before Harlow could voice them, the study group spilled into the hallway, led by Sophie. That was amazing, she exclaimed, her eyes bright with excitement. How did you see that transformation so quickly? Marcus shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. Sometimes an outside perspective helps, like the young man said. Evan hung back, his face a mixture of embarrassment and resentment. The other students crowded around, their earlier dismissiveness replaced by eager curiosity. Have you solved problems like this before? One asked. Are you some kind of math genius? Another chimed in. Do you work here because you like the quiet to think about equations? A third suggested, as if trying to construct a narrative that made sense of the janitor who could solve advanced calculus problems. Marcus held up his hands. I'm just doing my job, folks, and I really should get back to it. Wait, Sophie said, her expression suddenly serious. I want to hear more. Could we talk sometime? I'm working on a research project that involves similar techniques, and I could really use your insights. Before Marcus could respond, Professor Harlow intervened. I think we've taken enough of Mr. Johnson's time for one evening, but perhaps... He looked at Marcus with newfound respect. Perhaps we could continue this conversation another time if you're willing. Marcus nodded slowly. Perhaps. He picked up his mop and bucket. Good night, everyone. As he continued his rounds through the empty building, Marcus's mind was in turmoil. For 15 years, he'd kept his former life carefully separated from his present. 15 years of being invisible, of being just the man who cleaned the floors and emptied the trash. 15 years of watching brilliant young minds grapple with the same concepts he once mastered, never letting on that he understood their struggles and triumphs. Now, with a few equations hastily scrawled on a whiteboard, he had shattered that careful separation. The question was, what would happen next? Marcus returned to the small apartment he rented on the east side of town just after midnight, his body aching from the long shift. The place was modest but meticulously organized. Books lined the walls, most of them mathematics texts he'd collected over the years from library sales and thrift stores. He dropped his keys on the counter and headed straight for the shower, letting the hot water wash away the day's physical fatigue, while his mind remained stubbornly alert, replaying the events in room 307. He hadn't meant to reveal himself. For 15 years, he'd maintained the careful fiction that he was just Marcus the janitor, reliable, hardworking, invisible. Not Marcus Johnson, who had once been considered one of the most promising young mathematicians of his generation. Not the Marcus Johnson who had published 3 papers in prestigious journals before even completing his coursework at MIT. Not the Marcus Johnson who had walked away from it all. After toweling off and changing into worn sweatpants and a faded t-shirt, Marcus made himself a cup of tea and settled at the small desk in the corner of his living room. He opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a well-worn notebook, its pages filled with his neat, precise handwriting. Mathematical notations, equations, and proofs covered every available space. The private work he did when no one was watching, when he could be himself again. He flipped to a blank page and began writing out the problem from Professor Harlow's whiteboard from memory, then worked through his solution again, more carefully this time. There was something elegant about it, a beauty in the way the seemingly complex system reduced to something manageable through the right transformation. Mathematics had always been like that for him, a search for the hidden pattern, the unexpected symmetry that revealed the underlying simplicity of apparent chaos. A framed photograph on the bookshelf caught his eye, younger versions of himself and Dr. Eleanor Wilson, his doctoral advisor at MIT, both smiling after his successful qualification exams. Eleanor had believed in him, fought for him when others questioned whether he belonged in the program. Extraordinary talent, she'd written in his evaluation. One of the most intuitive mathematical minds I've encountered in 30 years of teaching. Marcus set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, memories washing over him. 20 years ago, he had been on a different path. The son of a postal worker and a nurse from South Chicago, he had defied expectations at every turn, perfect scores on standardized tests, full scholarship to the University of Illinois, early admission to MIT's doctoral program. Mathematics had been his ticket out, his way of proving that he belonged in spaces where people who looked like him were rarely seen. Then came the incident that changed everything. Marcus closed the notebook and returned it to the drawer. Some wounds never fully healed. They just became part of who you were. He checked his watch, nearly 1 a.m. He needed sleep. Tomorrow was Thursday, which meant the science buildings and the administrative offices. No reason to think he'd encounter Professor Harlow or any of those students again so soon, but as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Marcus couldn't help wondering if he'd made a mistake. 15 years of careful anonymity potentially undone by one moment of pride. He shouldn't have risen to that student's bait, shouldn't have picked up the marker, shouldn't have revealed what he knew. Sleep came eventually, but it was fitful and filled with dreams of equations that refused to balance and paths that circled back on themselves endlessly. Morning arrived too quickly. Marcus went through his usual routine: breakfast, coffee, the 20-minute walk to campus. The autumn air was crisp, leaves crunching beneath his feet as he cut across the quad. Students hurried past him, many with headphones on, eyes glued to phones, oblivious to his presence. This was how he preferred it, to move through the world unnoticed, just another part of the university's infrastructure. He'd almost reached the maintenance building when a voice called out behind him. "Mr. Johnson! Marcus! Wait up!" He turned to see Sophie jogging toward him, her backpack bouncing against her shoulder. He considered pretending not to hear, continuing on his way, but something in her expression, earnest, hopeful, made him stop. "Good morning," he said as she caught up to him, slightly out of breath. "I was hoping I'd run into you," she said, adjusting her backpack. "I couldn't stop thinking about what happened last night. The way you solved that problem. It was brilliant." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't that special, just a different approach. "Are you kidding? Professor Harlow said it was the kind of insight that could be published. He's been talking about you all morning." A cold feeling settled in Marcus's stomach. "Talking about me?" Sophie nodded enthusiastically. "He told the department chair about what happened. They're both really interested in learning more about your background." This was exactly what Marcus had feared. Attention, questions, people digging into his past. "Listen," he said, his voice firmer now. "I appreciate the interest, but I'm just here to do my job. Last night was an anomaly. I'd prefer if we could just forget it happened." Sophie's brow furrowed in confusion. "Forget it? But why? You clearly have an extraordinary gift for mathematics. Why would you want to hide that?" "It's complicated," Marcus replied, already backing away. "I really need to get to work now." "Wait," Sophie called as he turned to leave. "Professor Harlow asked me to invite you to join our study group, officially. As a contributor, not—" She hesitated. "Not as the janitor." Marcus paused, an unexpected flicker of longing rising in his chest. to engage with mathematics again in a formal setting, to discuss ideas with others who understood the language of equations and proofs. For a moment he allowed himself to imagine it. "I can't," he finally said. "Please thank the professor for the offer, but I can't." Before Sophie could respond, Marcus turned and walked quickly toward the maintenance building, his heart pounding. He should have known better. One moment of weakness, and now the careful boundaries he'd established were already crumbling. The morning passed in a blur of routine tasks, restocking supply closets, replacing light bulbs, mopping floors. Marcus worked methodically, finding comfort in the familiar physical labor that required just enough attention to keep his mind from wandering too far. By lunchtime, he had almost convinced himself that the whole situation would blow over. Professor Harlow would get distracted by his research. The students would move on to the next exciting thing, and Marcus would fade back into the background where he belonged. But when he entered the staff break room to eat his sandwich, he found Carl Watkins, his supervisor, waiting for him with an unusual expression, somewhere between confusion and annoyance. "There you are, Johnson," Carl said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Got a strange call about you this morning." Marcus sat down slowly, his appetite vanishing. "Oh?" "Yeah, from some Professor Harlow in the math department. Wanted to know if I could spare you for some special project they're working on. Said something about you having exceptional mathematical abilities that could be valuable to their research." Carl's eyes narrowed. "What's that all about?" Marcus chose his words carefully. "There was a situation last night. One of the students was struggling with a problem. I helped out. It wasn't a big deal." "Must have been some help if they're calling me about it," Carl replied, leaning forward. "Look, Johnson, you've been here, 15 years? Never given me any trouble. Always done solid work. But I don't like surprises. If there's something I should know about you, now's the time to tell me." Marcus met his supervisor's gaze. "I studied mathematics in college, advanced stuff. Sometimes I still remember enough to be helpful, that's all." Carl studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. "Your business, I guess. But if this professor keeps calling, it's going to become my business. I need to know if you're planning to keep working here or if you're looking to move on." "I'm not going anywhere," Marcus assured him. "This job is what I want, what I need." After lunch, Marcus deliberately chose tasks in buildings far from the mathematics department, hoping to avoid any further encounters. But as the afternoon wore on, he found himself growing increasingly anxious. The careful anonymity he had cultivated for 15 years felt suddenly precarious, as if the ground beneath his feet had shifted and might give way entirely. By the time his shift ended at 7, Marcus was exhausted, not from the physical work, but from the constant vigilance, the dread of being recognized, questioned, exposed. He was gathering his things from his locker when his phone buzzed with a text message from a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Johnson, this is Professor Harlow. I hope you don't mind, but I got your number from the staff directory. Could we meet to discuss your mathematical work? I believe there may be an opportunity here that would interest you." Marcus stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the screen. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to delete it, and pretend he never saw it. But another part, a part he thought he had silenced long ago, stirred with something like hope. Before he could decide how to respond, a second message appeared. "I've also been in touch with Dr. Eleanor Wilson at MIT. She remembers you quite fondly and was shocked to hear where you've ended up. She'd very much like to reconnect." Marcus's hand trembled slightly as he read the words. Eleanor, after all these years. The thought that she knew where he was, what he had become. Shame and regret washed over him in equal measure. He shoved the phone into his pocket without responding and left the building, walking quickly across the now quiet campus. The evening air had turned cool, and he pulled his jacket tighter around himself. His mind raced with competing thoughts. Flee or face this head-on. Continue hiding or finally confront the past he'd been running from. As he approached the mathematics building, he slowed his pace. Light still burned in several windows, including room 307. Almost without conscious decision, his feet carried him up the steps and through the door. The hallway was empty, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor. He wasn't due to clean this building until tomorrow, had no legitimate reason to be there, yet he found himself drawn forward like a man in a trance. When he reached room 307, he paused, peering through the small window in the door. Professor Harlow sat alone at the table, surrounded by papers and open textbooks, his brow furrowed in concentration as he scribbled equations on a notepad. He looked tired, frustrated, occasionally crossing out his work and starting again. Marcus watched for several minutes, recognizing the familiar rhythm of mathematical problem-solving, the false starts, the dead ends, the moments of insight followed by more roadblocks. He could see that Harlow was working on an extension of the problem from last night, trying to apply the transformation Marcus had shown them to a more complex system. And he could see exactly where Harlow was going wrong. Before he could reconsider, Marcus knocked on the door. Professor Harlow looked up, startled by the knock. When he saw Marcus through the glass, his expression shifted from surprise to eager anticipation. He waved him in, already gathering his papers as if preparing to share a great discovery. "Mr. Johnson," he said as Marcus entered, "I was hoping I'd see you again. Did you get my message?" Marcus nodded, remaining near the door. "I did. That's partly why I'm here." "Excellent, excellent," Harlow said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Please sit down. I've been working on an extension of the problem you solved last night. Actually, I've been at it for hours and I'm hitting a wall." Marcus hesitated, then slowly crossed the room and sat down. The familiar smell of chalk dust and dry erase markers brought back memories. Seminar rooms at MIT, late-night study sessions, the pure intellectual joy of wrestling with difficult problems alongside others who shared his passion. "I need to be clear about something first," Marcus said, his voice quiet but firm. "I didn't appreciate you contacting Dr. Wilson." Harlow had the decency to look slightly embarrassed. "I apologize for that. Professional curiosity got the better of me. After what you did last night, I wanted to understand your background better." He leaned forward. "Marcus, may I call you Marcus? Your work on that problem was extraordinary. When I described your approach to my colleagues this morning, they were amazed. No one had considered a cylindrical transformation for that particular class of problems." "It wasn't that innovative," Marcus said, though he knew it was. The approach had occurred to him because of work he'd done years ago on a similar problem, work that had never been published. "It was brilliant," Harlow insisted, "and it made me wonder what else you might be capable of." He pushed a notebook across the table. "That's why I've been working on this extension. I wanted to see if your approach could be generalized to higher dimensions, but I keep running into singularities at the boundary conditions." Despite himself, Marcus glanced at the notebook. The equations were dense, filling the page with a complex interplay of symbols and variables. His eyes traced the work, quickly identifying where Harlow had gone astray. "You're forcing the transformation," he said, almost automatically. "The symmetry isn't global for this extended problem. You need a piecewise approach, cylindrical coordinates near the origin, but something else at the boundaries." Harlow's eyes lit up. "Yes, that's it exactly. I was trying to maintain the same transformation throughout." He grabbed a pen and made a quick note. "What would you suggest for the boundary regions?" For a moment, Marcus was back in his element, discussing mathematics as an equal, not as someone to be overlooked or underestimated. The temptation to fully engage, to lose himself in the elegant dance of symbols and concepts, was powerful. But then reality reasserted itself. He wasn't a mathematician anymore. He was a janitor who had revealed too much and was now at risk of having his carefully constructed life upended. "Professor Harlow," Marcus said, straightening in his chair, "I didn't come here to discuss mathematics. I came to ask you to respect my privacy. What happened last night was a mistake on my part. I should never have intervened." Harlow's enthusiasm dimmed, replaced by confusion. "A mistake? Marcus, you displayed a level of mathematical insight that most PhD candidates would envy. How can sharing that be a mistake?" "Because that's not my life anymore," Marcus replied, an edge creeping into his voice. "I clean floors. I empty trash cans. I restock paper towels. That's who I am now, and I've made my peace with it." "But why?" Harlow asked, genuine bewilderment in his expression. "Eleanor Wilson told me you were one of the most promising students she'd ever mentored. She said your early papers on variational methods were groundbreaking. What happened?" Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "That's not something I care to discuss. Please just let this go. Tell your students to forget what they saw. I'm not a curiosity or a puzzle for you to solve." "Wait," Harlow said, rising as well. "I'm not trying to pry, but I can't just ignore talent like yours. The university has programs, resources. There might be a way for you to re-engage with mathematics without having to abandon your current position, if that's what you're worried about." Marcus shook his head. "You don't understand. I don't want to re-engage. I made my choice a long time ago." "Was it really a choice?" Harlow pressed, his voice softening. "Or was it something that was forced upon you?" The question hit too close to home, stirring memories Marcus had long tried to suppress. His hand tightened on the back of the chair, knuckles whitening with the pressure. "Professor, I appreciate your interest, but my past is my own. All I'm asking is that you respect my wishes and let this matter drop." Before Harlow could respond, the door opened and Sophie walked in carrying a stack of books. She stopped short when she saw Marcus. "Oh, Mr. Johnson, I didn't expect to see you here." Her surprise quickly gave way to enthusiasm. "I'm so glad you came. Did Professor Harlow tell you about the departmental seminar tomorrow? We were hoping you might attend." Marcus looked from Sophie to Harlow, a sense of being cornered rising within him. "I wasn't aware of any seminar, and as I was just explaining to Professor Harlow, I won't be participating in any mathematical discussions going forward." Sophie's face fell. "But why not? After what you showed us last night." "What I showed you was a moment of weakness," Marcus interrupted, his voice sharper than he intended. "It won't happen again." The hurt in Sophie's eyes made him immediately regret his tone. She hadn't done anything wrong. Neither of them had, really. They were simply responding to what they'd witnessed, unable to reconcile the man who mopped floors with the mathematician who could solve complex problems with elegant ease. "I'm sorry," he said more gently. "I don't mean to be harsh, but this isn't a fairy tale where the janitor turns out to be a secret genius who just needs to be discovered. My life is what it is for reasons that are personal and painful, and I'd prefer not to have them dissected by well-meaning strangers." An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Sophie clutched her books tighter to her chest, while Harlow stood with his hands in his pockets, a thoughtful frown on his face. "Marcus," Harlow finally said, "no one is trying to dissect your life. But I would be remiss as an educator if I didn't at least try to understand why someone with your gifts would choose to, well, not use them." "Who says I don't use them?" Marcus replied quietly. "Just because I don't publish papers or teach classes doesn't mean my mind has gone dormant." "Then what do you do with it?" Sophie asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "Do you still work on problems? Do you read journals?" The questions weren't accusatory, just interested, and something in her tone, the absence of judgment, made Marcus hesitate. For 15 years, he had kept his mathematical life entirely private, sharing it with no one. The thought of acknowledging it, even in this small way, felt like stepping onto uncertain ground. "Sometimes," he admitted, "when I have time." "What kinds of problems?" Harlow asked, seizing on this small opening. Marcus shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "Various things, mostly extensions of work I was doing before." "At MIT?" Sophie asked. Marcus nodded reluctantly. "Have you published any of it?" Harlow pressed. "No," Marcus said firmly. "That part of my life is over." Harlow exchanged a glance with Sophie, then seemed to come to a decision. "Marcus, would you at least consider looking at something for me? No strings attached, no pressure to engage further if you don't want to. Just a professional opinion." Against his better judgment, Marcus found himself asking, "What is it?" Harlow moved to a filing cabinet in the corner of the room and extracted a folder. "I've been working on a paper for the past year, an extension of Calderon's problem to non-Euclidean manifolds. I've hit a roadblock with one of the proofs, and from what Eleanor told me about your work, you might have some insight." He held out the folder, and Marcus stared at it as if it might bite him. This was dangerous territory, a direct invitation back into the world he had fled, a world that had once promised so much before cruelly closing its doors. "Just take it," Harlow said when Marcus didn't move. "Read it or don't, your choice. But if you do read it and have any thoughts, I'd be grateful to hear them." After another moment of hesitation, Marcus took the folder. "I'm not promising anything." "Of course not," Harlow agreed quickly. "And for what it's worth, I'll respect your privacy. No more calls to MIT, no discussions with other faculty about your background without your permission." Marcus nodded once, tucking the folder under his arm. "Thank you. I should go now." As he turned to leave, Sophie spoke up. "Mr. Johnson, our study group meets again on Friday evening, same room. You'd be welcome to join us. Not as anything other than someone who loves mathematics. No pressure, no expectations." Her earnestness was disarming, and for a brief moment, Marcus allowed himself to imagine it, sitting around the table with these young students, discussing problems, sharing insights, being recognized for his mind rather than his janitorial uniform. "I'll think about it," he said, knowing even as the words left his mouth that he was opening a door he had kept firmly shut for 15 years. Outside, the campus was quiet, most students already gone for the day. Marcus walked slowly across the quad, the folder heavy under his arm, his thoughts in turmoil. He had come to Harlow's office intending to shut down any further interest in his mathematical abilities, but instead, he had left with an invitation and a research paper. When he reached his apartment, he set the folder on his kitchen table and stared at it for a long time without opening it. Inside were equations and proofs, abstractions that had once been the center of his existence. To engage with them again, even privately, felt like a risk, a step back toward a world that had rejected him, a world where people like Evan Patterson felt entitled to mock him for his current station without knowing the journey that had brought him there. Marcus made himself dinner, a simple pasta dish, and ate it standing at the counter, his eyes repeatedly drawn to the folder. After washing his dishes, he finally sat down at the table, took a deep breath, and opened it. Harlow's paper was dense but elegantly structured, exploring an interesting extension of a classic inverse problem. Marcus read through it slowly, his mind gradually shifting back into the analytical mode he had once inhabited so naturally. The professor's work was solid, but Marcus could immediately see where he had gone wrong in the troublesome proof, a subtle flaw in his approach to the boundary conditions, much like the issue in his extension of last night's problem. Without thinking, Marcus reached for a pen and began making notes in the margin. The mathematical part of his brain, dormant for so long in his daily life but active in his private studies, surged forward with a familiar rush of clarity and insight. He lost track of time as he worked through the problem, sketching out an alternative approach that avoided the singularities Harlow had encountered. It was nearly midnight when he finally set down his pen and rubbed his tired eyes. The proof was elegant, concise, and he was certain correct. He had solved in hours a problem that had apparently stymied Harlow for months, and now he had a decision to make. He could return the folder tomorrow with his notes, potentially opening himself up to more questions, more pressure to re-engage with the mathematical community. Or he could erase his work, return the paper untouched, and maintain the boundaries he had established for so long. As he prepared for bed, Marcus's thoughts drifted to Sophie and her earnest invitation. There had been no condescension in her manner, no sense that she viewed him as a curiosity or an anomaly. Just a genuine recognition of shared passion, an invitation to connect through the language of mathematics that had once been his native tongue. Perhaps, he thought as he drifted toward sleep, there was a middle path, a way to acknowledge his mathematical self without fully exposing the wounds of his past. Perhaps after 15 years, it was time to stop running. Morning arrived with a clarity that matched Marcus's resolve. He had slept better than he had in weeks, as if the act of engaging with mathematics again had settled something in him. The folder sat on his kitchen table where he had left it, filled now with his neat annotations and the solution that had flowed from his pen with surprising ease. He had made his decision. He would return the folder to Professor Harlow, acknowledge his work on the proof, but maintain firm boundaries about his past and his future. This wasn't about rekindling an academic career. It was simply one mathematician helping another with a difficult problem. As he prepared for work, Marcus felt a curious lightness. For 15 years he had carried the weight of his abandoned potential like a stone in his chest. The simple act of solving Harlow's proof hadn't removed that weight entirely, but it had shifted it somehow, made it more bearable. The campus was bustling with morning activity when he arrived. Students streamed toward lecture halls, professors hurried across the quad with coffee cups in hand, and the routine of university life unfolded around him as it had every day for the past 15 years. Yet today, Marcus felt slightly out of step with it all, as if he were moving between two worlds, the familiar world of his janitorial duties and the once familiar world of mathematical inquiry. He reported to the maintenance building as usual, checking in with Carl and collecting his assignments for the day. The administrative offices were on his schedule, along with the psychology department. The mathematics building wouldn't be his responsibility until tomorrow. If he wanted to return Harlow's folder, he would need to make a special trip. "You feeling all right, Johnson?" Carl asked, eyeing him with mild concern. "You seem distracted." "I'm fine," Marcus assured him. "Just didn't sleep well." Carl nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "Well, try to focus today. The psychology department is hosting some big-shot visitor this afternoon. They want everything spotless." "Will do," Marcus promised, gathering his supplies. The morning passed in a familiar routine of cleaning bathrooms, vacuuming offices, and restocking supplies. Marcus worked efficiently, his body performing the tasks it knew so well, while his mind occasionally drifted to the elegant solution he had crafted the night before. He wondered what Harlow would make of it, whether the professor would recognize the deeper implications of the approach Marcus had taken. During his lunch break, Marcus made his decision. He would walk over to the mathematics building and leave the folder in Harlow's mailbox, a way of sharing his work without having to engage in another potentially uncomfortable conversation. He finished his sandwich quickly and headed across campus, the folder tucked securely under his arm. The mathematics department office was quiet when he arrived, with only a student assistant manning the front desk. The young man barely glanced up from his textbook as Marcus entered. "I need to leave something in Professor Harlow's mailbox," Marcus explained. The student pointed to a wall of wooden cubbies behind him. "Faculty mailboxes are right there. Harlow's is third row, second from the left." Marcus nodded his thanks and moved toward the mailboxes. He was just about to slip the folder into Harlow's cubby when a familiar voice spoke behind him. "Mr. Johnson." What a pleasant surprise. Marcus turned to find Professor Harlow standing in the doorway of the office, a stack of papers in his hands and a pleased expression on his face. "Professor," Marcus acknowledged with a slight nod. "I was just returning your paper." Harlow's eyes lit up. "Excellent timing. I was hoping to catch you today." He gestured toward his office down the hall. "Do you have a few minutes to discuss it?" Marcus hesitated, glancing at his watch. "I'm on my lunch break. I need to be back at work in 15 minutes. "That should be plenty of time," Harlow said eagerly, already moving toward his office. "I'm just curious whether you had any insights on my problem." Seeing no graceful way to avoid the conversation, Marcus followed Harlow down the hall. The professor's office was cluttered, but organized in the way of someone who knew exactly where everything was amid the apparent chaos. Books lined every available surface, and mathematical journals were stacked in precarious towers on the floor. "Please sit," Harlow said, clearing a chair of books. He took the folder from Marcus and opened it, his eyes quickly scanning the notes Marcus had added. His expression changed from curiosity to astonishment as he read. "This is remarkable," he murmured, turning pages. "You've completely restructured the approach to the boundary conditions." He looked up at Marcus, his eyes wide with admiration. "I've been stuck on this for months, and you solved it in one evening." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Your approach was sound. You just needed to consider a different coordinate system near the singularities." "Of course," Harlow said, smacking his forehead with his palm. "A hybrid approach. It's so elegant I can't believe I didn't see it." He studied Marcus with renewed interest. "This level of insight, it's extraordinary. Eleanor was right about you." At the mention of his former advisor, Marcus stiffened. "Professor, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but as I said yesterday, I'm not interested in returning to academic mathematics. I simply helped with a proof because you asked me to." Harlow set the folder down, his expression turning serious. "Marcus, may I speak frankly?" "You've been nothing but frank so far," Marcus replied with a hint of wariness. "What happened at MIT?" Harlow asked directly. "Eleanor wouldn't give me details, said it wasn't her story to tell, but she mentioned an incident involving a faculty member named Whitmore. She said it was unjust." The name sent a jolt through Marcus like an electric current. Professor Lawrence Whitmore, the man who had single-handedly derailed his academic career. The memories came flooding back, sharp and painful despite the years that had passed. "That's not something I discuss," Marcus said, his voice tight. He stood, ready to leave. "I should get back to work." "Wait," Harlow said quickly. "I'm not asking out of idle curiosity. I'm asking because I think you've been carrying this burden alone for too long." He hesitated, then added, "And because Whitmore is giving a guest lecture here next month." Marcus froze, his hand on the doorknob. "What?" "The department is hosting a symposium on recent advances in applied mathematics. Whitmore is one of the invited speakers." Harlow watched Marcus carefully. "I didn't make the connection until I spoke with Eleanor yesterday. Now I'm wondering if we should reconsider the invitation." A cold numbness spread through Marcus's chest. Lawrence Whitmore, here, on this campus. The man would probably walk right past him without a second glance, without any recognition of the life he had destroyed. "It doesn't matter," Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It was a long time ago." "Clearly it matters," Harlow responded gently. "Look at where you are, what you're doing. A mind like yours mopping floors instead of advancing mathematical knowledge. Something significant must have happened." Marcus turned back to face Harlow, wrestling with emotions he had suppressed for years. Part of him wanted to simply walk away, to return to the safety of his routine and his anonymity. But another part, a part that had awakened when he first picked up that marker in room 307, longed to finally speak the truth. "Whitmore accused me of plagiarism," he said at last, the words painful in his throat. "He claimed a paper I published contained ideas stolen from his unpublished work." Harlow's brow furrowed. "Was there any truth to it?" "None," Marcus replied, a flash of the old anger returning. "I had never even seen his unpublished work. The approach I developed was entirely my own. Building on existing literature, yes, but original in its execution." "What happened?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "What do you think happened? It was his word against mine. An established professor with tenure versus a black graduate student from the south side of Chicago. Even with Eleanor's support, the Academic Integrity Committee put my doctoral studies on hold, pending a full investigation." "But surely they eventually cleared you?" Harlow asked, looking troubled. "The investigation dragged on for months," Marcus said, the memories still sharp enough to cut. "My funding was suspended. I couldn't advance my research. Other faculty started treating me differently. Nothing overt, just subtle changes in how they interacted with me, as if the mere accusation had tainted me somehow." He paused, the familiar tightness in his chest returning as he recalled those dark days. Then came the final blow. Whitmore published a paper that used the same approach I had developed, but with enough differences in the formulation to claim it as his own original work. He effectively stole my ideas while accusing me of stealing his. "That's..." Harlow seemed at a loss for words. "Academic theft," Marcus finished for him. "But I couldn't prove it. By then I was drowning in debt, my reputation was in tatters, and my mental health was suffering. So I walked away, withdrew from the program, left Boston, and eventually ended up here." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of Marcus's revelation. Harlow sat back in his chair, visibly processing what he had just heard. "Have you ever considered fighting to clear your name?" he finally asked. "Especially now, with greater awareness of systemic biases in academia?" Marcus shook his head. "What would be the point? It's been 15 years. Whitmore has gone on to become even more respected in the field. He's won awards for work that built on ideas he took from me. Who would believe me now?" "I would," said a voice from the doorway. Both men turned to find Sophie standing there, her expression a mixture of shock and indignation. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop. Professor Harlow's door was ajar, and I was just dropping off my assignment when you heard something not meant for your ears," Marcus finished, his voice tinged with resignation. Sophie stepped into the office, closing the door behind her. "Mr. Johnson, Marcus, what happened to you was wrong, profoundly wrong. And the fact that you've been silently carrying this burden while continuing to love mathematics enough to help us with that problem, it's incredible." Her words, spoken with such sincere conviction, caught Marcus off guard. He had expected judgment, skepticism, or at best pity. Instead, Sophie's eyes held something closer to righteous anger on his behalf. "It doesn't change anything," he said, though without the certainty he had felt moments before. "It changes everything," Sophie insisted. "Professor Whitmore shouldn't be allowed to continue benefiting from what he stole from you. There must be a way to address this, even after all these years." Marcus looked from Sophie to Harlow, uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. I appreciate your concern, both of you, but this isn't something I want to revisit. I've made my peace with where I am now. Have you really? Harlow asked quietly. Is that why you still work on mathematics in private? Why you couldn't help yourself from solving that problem in my class? Why you were able to resolve my proof in a single evening? Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed, a reminder that his lunch break was over and he needed to return to work. I have to go, he said, grateful for the interruption. Thank you for your interest, but I'm not looking to reopen old wounds. As he turned to leave, Sophie stepped forward. Will you at least consider coming to our study group tomorrow night? No pressure about your past, no expectations about your future, just mathematics. Marcus paused, his hand on the doorknob once again. The invitation was tempting, more tempting than he wanted to admit. After so long in isolation, the thought of discussing mathematics with others who shared his passion pulled at something deep within him. I'll think about it, he said, and this time he truly meant it. The following day passed in a blur of routine tasks, but Marcus's mind was elsewhere. As he cleaned the psychology department's lecture halls, restocked supply closets, and polished water fountains, the conversation with Harlow and Sophie replayed in his head. He had revealed more about his past in those few minutes than he had to anyone in 15 years, and the weight of that disclosure left him feeling oddly vulnerable, as if he had reopened a wound he had convinced himself was long healed. The news that Lawrence Whitmore would soon be on campus had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. The thought of potentially encountering the man who had derailed his career, of watching him receive accolades for ideas that might have originated with Marcus's work, it stirred a simmering anger he had thought long extinguished. By the time his shift ended on Friday evening, Marcus had been turning Sophie's invitation over in his mind for hours. The study group would be meeting in room 307 at 7. He had every reason to avoid it, to maintain the barriers he had so carefully constructed between his present life and his mathematical past. Yet he found himself lingering on campus rather than heading home, his feet eventually carrying him toward the mathematics building as if drawn by some invisible force. The autumn evening was cool, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky as Marcus climbed the steps to the building's entrance. He paused at the door, his hand on the handle still uncertain. Through the glass he could see lights burning in various rooms, including room 307. He took a deep breath and pulled the door open. The hallway was quiet, most offices dark at this hour. As Marcus approached room 307, he could hear voices within, the animated discussions of students engaged with ideas that excited them. He hesitated outside, suddenly aware that he was still wearing his janitorial uniform. Perhaps he should have gone home to change first. Perhaps he shouldn't have come at all. Just as he was considering leaving, the door opened and Sophie almost collided with him. "Oh!" she exclaimed in surprise, then broke into a wide smile. "You came. I was just heading to the vending machine for snacks." She gestured for him to enter. "Come in, we're just getting started." Before he could formulate an excuse, Marcus found himself ushered into the room. 5 students sat around the table, including Evan Patterson, who looked up with obvious surprise at Marcus's arrival. Professor Harlow stood at the whiteboard, marker in hand, in the middle of explaining a concept. "Mr. Johnson," Harlow said warmly, "I'm glad you decided to join us." All eyes turned to Marcus, and he fought the urge to retreat. He was acutely aware of his uniform, of the boundary he was crossing by being here not as the janitor but as... what exactly? A participant? A mathematician? A ghost from another life? "I can't stay long," Marcus said, remaining near the door. "I just thought I'd see what you were working on." "Perfect timing," Harlow replied, gesturing to the whiteboard. "We're discussing applications of the transformation approach you showed us on Wednesday. Sophie suggested we might apply similar techniques to a class of optimization problems in machine learning. Marcus glanced at the equations on the board, immediately recognizing the direction Harlow was taking. Without thinking, he commented, "You'd need to modify the boundary conditions to account for the high-dimensional nature of the feature space." The room fell silent for a moment. Then Harlow smiled. "Exactly right. Would you care to elaborate?" Before Marcus could decide how to respond, Sophie returned with an armful of snacks from the vending machine. "Don't just stand by the door," she said, dropping the snacks on the table and pulling out a chair. "Sit with us." Her casual acceptance, free of any awkwardness about his position at the university, made it difficult to refuse. Marcus slowly made his way to the offered chair, aware of the curious glances from the other students. "Everyone," Harlow said, "I believe some of you have already met Marcus Johnson. He'll be joining our discussion tonight." A chorus of greetings followed, with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Evans was notably muted, his expression a mixture of confusion and discomfort. "So, Mr. Johnson," one of the students Marcus didn't recognize said, "Professor Harlow mentioned you studied mathematics before. Where did you go to school?" The direct question brought the conversation to the very topic Marcus had hoped to avoid. He glanced at Harlow, who looked slightly apologetic. "I was at MIT, Marcus said simply, not elaborating. "MIT?" another student exclaimed. "That's impressive. Did you finish your degree?" "Let's focus on the mathematics, shall we?" Harlow intervened, sensing Marcus's discomfort. "We were discussing the application of coordinate transformations to optimization problems." Marcus shot him a grateful look as the conversation returned to the topic at hand. Gradually, as the discussion progressed, Marcus found himself drawn in despite his reservations. The familiar rhythm of mathematical discourse, the proposal of ideas, the questioning, the collaborative refinement, awakened something in him that had lain dormant for too long. Almost without realizing it, he stood and approached the whiteboard, taking a marker from Harlow. "If you consider the problem this way," he said, beginning to write, "the transformation becomes much more intuitive." For the next hour, Marcus lost himself in the pure joy of mathematical exploration. He forgot about his uniform, about his job, about the careful boundaries he had maintained for 15 years. He was simply a mathematician again, engaged in the work that had once been the center of his existence. The students watched in amazement as he effortlessly navigated complex concepts, offering insights that clarified and extended their understanding. Even Evan seemed grudgingly impressed, though he remained largely silent throughout the discussion. It was nearly 9 o'clock when Marcus glanced at his watch and realized how much time had passed. "I should go," he said, suddenly self-conscious again. "It's getting late." "This was incredible," Sophie said, her eyes bright with excitement. "The way you approached that last problem, I never would have thought of using that substitution." The other students nodded in agreement, looking at Marcus with new respect. Only Evan remained reserved, his expression thoughtful as he studied Marcus with an intensity that suggested he was trying to reconcile the janitor he had mocked with the mathematician he had just witnessed. "Our group meets every Friday," Harlow said as Marcus gathered his things. "You're always welcome to join us, Marcus. No pressure, just an open invitation." Marcus nodded, not committing but not refusing either. As he turned to leave, Sophie walked with him to the door. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. "I know it couldn't have been easy, especially with—" She glanced back at Evan. "It was fine," Marcus assured her. "Actually, it was nice. I'd forgotten what it feels like to discuss mathematics like that." Sophie smiled. "You were in your element. Anyone could see that." She hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking about what you told Professor Harlow yesterday, about Dr. Whitmore. I did some research." Marcus stiffened. "I told you," I don't want to revisit that. I know, she said quickly, but I found something interesting. The paper where Whitmore allegedly used your ideas, it's been cited hundreds of times. It's considered foundational in the field now, and there's a symposium being organized around its 15th anniversary. That's why he's coming to campus next month. The news hit Marcus like a physical blow. Not only was Whitmore coming to Westridge, but he was being celebrated for work that had its origins in ideas Whitmore had stolen from him. The irony was almost too bitter to bear. "Sophie," he said, his voice low and controlled, "I appreciate your interest, but this is exactly why I've kept my past separate from my present. Some wounds don't heal when you expose them to air. They just start bleeding again." She looked at him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "But what if there was a way to set the record straight, to finally get recognition for your contribution?" "There isn't," Marcus said firmly. "It's been too long, and Whitmore is too established. No one would believe me." "I believe you," Sophie said simply. "Professor Harlow believes you, and Dr. Wilson at MIT believes you. That's a start, isn't it?" Before Marcus could respond, Evan appeared behind Sophie. "Excuse me," he said, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "Mr. Johnson, could I speak with you for a moment?" Sophie glanced between them, then nodded. "I'll wait for you inside," she told Evan, giving Marcus's arm a gentle squeeze before returning to the classroom. Marcus braced himself, unsure what to expect from the young man who had mockingly challenged him just 2 days ago. "I wanted to apologize," Evan said, not quite meeting Marcus's eyes. "For Wednesday night, the way I spoke to you was disrespectful." The apology seemed genuine, if uncomfortable. Marcus studied him for a moment before responding. "Apology accepted. We all make assumptions about people based on limited information." Evan nodded, looking relieved. "The way you worked through those problems tonight, it was impressive. I've never seen anyone approach those concepts with such clarity." He hesitated, then added, "If you don't mind me asking, how did someone with your mathematical ability end up?" He trailed off, apparently realizing the potential offensiveness of his question. "Working as a janitor," Marcus finished for him, a hint of challenge in his voice. Evan had the grace to look embarrassed. "I didn't mean it like that. It seems like a waste of your talent." "Life doesn't always take the path we expect, Mr. Patterson," Marcus replied evenly. "And there's dignity in all honest work, regardless of how society values it." The young man nodded, looking chastened. "Yes, of course, I didn't mean to imply otherwise." He shifted awkwardly. "Anyway, I just wanted to apologize, and to say that I hope you'll come back to the study group. Your insights were really valuable." With that, he retreated back to the classroom, leaving Marcus alone in the hallway. The interaction had been unexpected. A small acknowledgement that perhaps his presence in that room, sharing his mathematical knowledge, had challenged at least one person's preconceptions. As Marcus walked home through the quiet campus, his emotions were a complex tangle. The evening had awakened something in him, a hunger for intellectual engagement that cleaning floors and emptying trash cans could never satisfy. Yet it had also stirred up painful memories and raised uncomfortable questions about the path his life had taken. Sophie's words echoed in his mind. Was there truly a way to set the record straight after all these years? And even if there was, did he have the courage to confront Whitmore and the academic establishment that had so easily dismissed him? By the time he reached his apartment, Marcus had made one decision at least. He would return to the study group next Friday. The joy he had experienced in discussing mathematics again was too powerful to deny himself. As for Whitmore and the past that still haunted him, that was a problem he wasn't yet ready to solve. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus fell into a new routine. By day, he continued his work as a janitor, moving through the campus with mop and bucket largely invisible to the students and faculty who passed him in the hallways. But on Friday evenings, he transformed into something else entirely: a mathematician, a teacher, a mentor to the small group of students who now looked at him with undisguised admiration. Word had spread quickly among the mathematics department about the janitor with the extraordinary mind. Attendance at Harlow's study group doubled, then tripled as curious students came to witness Marcus in action. Some came with skepticism, unable to believe the rumors until they saw him effortlessly solve problems that had stumped graduate students. Others came with genuine interest in learning from someone who approached mathematics with such elegant insight. For Marcus, these Friday evenings became a lifeline, a connection to the part of himself he had suppressed for so long. Despite his initial reservations, he found himself looking forward to the sessions, preparing for them by reviewing topics in his notebooks, anticipating the questions that might arise. "You've transformed the group," Harlow remarked after the third session as they stayed behind to clean the whiteboards covered in Marcus's neat handwriting. "I've never seen the students so engaged." Marcus smiled faintly, erasing a complex equation. "They're good kids, eager to learn." "They're inspired by you," Harlow replied. "Not just by your mathematical abilities, but by your story, or at least the parts of it they've pieced together." He paused, watching Marcus carefully. "There's been talk among the faculty as well." Marcus's hand stilled on the whiteboard. "What kind of talk?" "Several of my colleagues have attended the sessions. They're impressed, to say the least. The department chair is interested in meeting you." The eraser remained frozen in Marcus's hand. "I'm not looking for attention from the faculty, Richard." It was the first time he had used Harlow's first name, a small but significant shift in their relationship. Over the past 2 weeks, they had gradually moved from the formality of Professor Harlow and Mr. Johnson to something closer to collegiality, though Marcus still maintained certain boundaries. "I understand that," Harlow said gently. "But word is spreading. The story of the janitor who outmatches the professors in mathematical insight, it's captivating. And when people learn you were once at MIT..." "That's exactly what I want to avoid," Marcus interrupted, resuming his methodical erasing. "I'm happy to work with the students, to discuss mathematics informally, but I have no interest in becoming a curiosity for the faculty to examine." Harlow sighed, helping Marcus clear the second whiteboard. "I respect that. But I should warn you, Lawrence Whitmore's visit is confirmed for 3 weeks from now, November 12th. He'll be giving a lecture on revolutionary approaches to variational methods, which, from what you've told me, likely includes your ideas." Marcus absorbed this information in silence, the tension evident in the set of his shoulders. "I'll make sure to be assigned to a different building that day." "Is that really what you want?" Harlow asked, his voice quiet but pointed. "To hide from him again?" Marcus turned, his expression hardening. "I'm not hiding. I'm avoiding a confrontation that would serve no purpose except to reopen old wounds. Or perhaps to finally heal them properly," Harlow suggested. Before Marcus could respond, Sophie entered the now empty classroom, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She had become something of a bridge between Marcus and the other students, her natural warmth and genuine respect helping to ease the initial awkwardness of his unusual position. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, sensing the tension. "I just wanted to return this." She held out a book, an advanced text on differential geometry that Marcus had recommended when she'd struggled with a particular concept. "Was it helpful?" Marcus asked, grateful for the change of subject. Sophie nodded enthusiastically. "The chapter on manifold structures clarified everything. I can't believe I didn't see the connection before." She hesitated, then added, "A few of us were going to grab coffee at the campus cafe. We were hoping you might join us." The invitation caught Marcus off guard. The study sessions were one thing, a controlled environment where the focus remained firmly on mathematics. But casual socializing with students, sitting in a cafe where he was normally only present to clean tables and empty trash bins, that crossed a different kind of boundary. "I appreciate the invitation," he said carefully, "but I should head home. It's been a long day." Disappointment flickered across Sophie's face, but she nodded in understanding. Another time, maybe. Though, she glanced at Harlow, then back to Marcus. "I actually had an ulterior motive for asking. Dr. Wilson is visiting campus next week. She's giving a guest lecture in the engineering department. I thought you might want to know." Marcus froze. "Eleanor is coming here?" "Yes," Harlow confirmed. "I meant to tell you. She's collaborating with some colleagues in engineering on a project involving mathematical modeling of complex systems. When I mentioned you were here, she was quite eager to reconnect." The news that his former advisor would soon be on campus sent a complicated surge of emotions through Marcus. Eleanor Wilson had been his strongest advocate at MIT, had fought for him when Whitmore's accusations first surfaced. She had been devastated when he withdrew from the program, had tried repeatedly to convince him to stay and fight. Her belief in him had never wavered, even when his own had crumbled. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," Marcus said, though with less conviction than his previous refusals. "She asked specifically about you," Sophie said. "Apparently, Professor Harlow has kept her updated on your contributions to our study group." Marcus shot Harlow a look that was part accusation, part resignation. "Only in general terms," Harlow defended himself. "I thought she deserved to know that her faith in you was justified, that despite everything, you never lost your gift for mathematics." Marcus sighed, running a hand over his close-cropped hair. The carefully constructed walls he had built between his past and present were crumbling faster than he could reinforce them. First the study group, now Eleanor's impending visit, and looming over it all, Whitmore's arrival and the painful memories it would inevitably resurrect. "I need to think about this," he finally said. "When exactly is she coming?" "Next Thursday," Harlow replied. "Her lecture is at 2, but she'll be on campus all day." Marcus nodded, gathering his few belongings. "I'll let you know." As he walked home that evening, the crisp autumn air filled his lungs, bringing with it a clarity that had been missing in the charged atmosphere of the classroom. The campus was quiet, most students already gone for the weekend, and Marcus found himself wandering toward the small pond at the center of the university grounds rather than heading directly home. He sat on a bench overlooking the water, watching the reflection of the moon ripple across its surface. 20 years ago, he had been a young man with limitless potential, on track to become one of the bright lights in his field. Then came Whitmore's accusation, the suspension, the months of investigation that led nowhere while his reputation and confidence eroded. The final blow had been seeing his ideas, repackaged and slightly modified, appear in Whitmore's groundbreaking paper, ideas that had secured the older mathematician's legacy, while Marcus's own career lay in ruins. The bitterness of that memory still had the power to constrict his chest, to make his hands clench involuntarily. He had left Boston with nothing but a suitcase of clothes and a box of books, abandoning not just his academic career, but the identity he had built around it. For months he had drifted, taking whatever jobs would pay the rent: retail, food service, manual labor. Mathematics became something he did in private, a secret pleasure tinged with pain, like returning to the scene of a devastating loss. When he landed the janitorial position at Westridge University 15 years ago, it had seemed like a cruel joke at first, surrounded by the trappings of academic life while being firmly excluded from it. But over time, he had found a measure of peace in the routine, in the simple satisfaction of a job well done, in the quiet hours when the buildings were empty and he could work unobserved. Now, that carefully constructed peace was unraveling. The past 3 weeks had reawakened ambitions and resentments he had thought long buried. The joy of engaging with mathematics again, of being recognized for his mind rather than his labor, was intoxicating. But with it came the painful awareness of all he had lost, all that had been taken from him. The sound of footsteps on the path drew him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Carl Watkins, his supervisor, approaching with a surprised expression. "Johnson, didn't expect to find you here this late." Marcus straightened on the bench. "Just taking a moment before heading home." Carl nodded, hesitating before sitting down beside him. "Been meaning to talk to you. Heard some interesting rumors these past couple weeks." Marcus tensed. Of course, word would have reached the maintenance department eventually. "About the study group, I assume." "That and more." Carl gazed out at the pond. "Apparently you've been giving impromptu lectures that have half the math department talking. Even heard the department chair is interested in meeting you." "It's not that dramatic," Marcus said. "I've just been helping with a study group on Friday evenings." Carl was silent for a moment, then, "Known you 15 years, Johnson. Never figured you for a mathematician." There was no judgment in his tone, just genuine curiosity. Marcus shrugged. "It was a long time ago." "Must have been hard," Carl said unexpectedly. "Cleaning the same buildings where other folks get to do what you're trained for." The simple acknowledgement of that difficulty, something Marcus had never discussed with anyone at Westridge before the past few weeks, caught him off guard. "It was an adjustment," he admitted. Carl nodded slowly. "My sister was like that. Full scholarship to law school, top of her class. Then our mom got sick, and she had to drop out to care for her. Never went back. Ended up doing paralegal work instead." He turned to look at Marcus directly. "She always said the hardest part wasn't the job itself. It was watching others do what she should have been doing." The parallel wasn't exact, but the understanding behind it was genuine. Marcus found himself oddly touched by the revelation. "Your sister sounds like a remarkable woman." "She is," Carl agreed. "Stubborn as hell, too. Wouldn't let anyone help her. Wouldn't talk about what she'd lost." He stood, stretching his back. "Took her years to realize that holding it all in was just making it worse." The message wasn't subtle, but it wasn't patronizing either. Just one man recognizing something familiar in another's struggle. "Anyway," Carl continued, "I'm not here to pry. Just wanted to say that if you need different hours or assignments to accommodate these study sessions, we can work something out. You've been reliable for 15 years. You've earned some flexibility." The offer was unexpected and genuinely appreciated. "Thank you, Carl. I might take you up on that." Carl nodded, already turning to leave. "One more thing, Johnson. Whatever happened that took you from mathematics to maintenance, don't let it define the rest of your life. 15 years is a long time to carry something." With that, he continued down the path, leaving Marcus alone with thoughts that suddenly seemed less settled than they had been for years. The engineering building gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, its modern glass facade a stark contrast to the older, more traditional structures that dominated most of Westridge's campus. Marcus stood across the quad, watching students and faculty file into the main lecture hall where Eleanor Wilson would be speaking in less than 20 minutes. He had requested the afternoon off, a first in his 15 years at the university, and Carl had granted it without question. Now, dressed in khakis and a button-down shirt rather than his usual uniform, Marcus found himself paralyzed with indecision. Seeing Eleanor again after all these years would reopen doors he had firmly closed, would force conversations he had spent more than a decade avoiding. Yet the pull to reconnect with the woman who had believed in him, who had fought for him when others had not, was powerful. "Marcus." The familiar voice behind him sent a jolt through his body. He turned slowly to find Eleanor Wilson standing there, her hair now streaked with silver, but her eyes as sharp and kind as he remembered. She was smaller than he recalled, or perhaps he had grown in his perception of himself since those days at MIT. "Eleanor," he said, her name feeling strange on his tongue after so many years. For a moment they simply looked at each other, the weight of 15 years of silence and separation hanging between them. Then Eleanor stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him in a fierce hug. "My God, it's really you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "When Richard told me you were here, I could hardly believe it." Marcus returned the embrace awkwardly at first, then with genuine warmth as the familiar comfort of her presence broke through his reserve. When they separated, Eleanor held him at arm's length, studying his face. "You look well," she said, though her eyes noted everything that had changed. The lines around his eyes, the strands of gray at his temples, the wariness in his expression that hadn't been there when he was her student. "So do you," he replied, meaning it. There was a vitality about Eleanor that age had not diminished. "Congratulations on the Hoffman Prize. I read about it." She waved a hand dismissively. "Just another plaque to gather dust. Nothing compared to seeing you again." She glanced at her watch. "I have to give this lecture, but afterward, can we talk? Really talk?" Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that." "Good. Meet me at the faculty club at 4. We can have some privacy there." With another quick hug, Eleanor hurried toward the lecture hall, leaving Marcus with the growing realization that he had just committed to a conversation he had been avoiding for 15 years. The faculty club was nearly empty when Marcus arrived at 4 o'clock. A few professors sat in deep leather chairs, engrossed in conversation or reading, but none paid him any attention as he waited near the entrance. It was strange being in this space, a place ordinarily off-limits to maintenance staff, where he had only entered before to empty trash bins or clean up after events. Eleanor arrived 15 minutes later, slightly flushed from her lecture and subsequent discussions. "Sorry to keep you waiting," she said, guiding him to a quiet corner with 2 comfortable chairs overlooking a small garden. "Academic questions never end precisely when the lecture does." "I remember," Marcus said with a small smile. A server approached, and Eleanor ordered tea for both of them without asking, just as she had done countless times during their advising sessions at MIT. The familiarity of the gesture brought a rush of memories. Afternoons spent discussing mathematical concepts, Eleanor challenging his thinking, pushing him to refine his arguments, to see connections he had missed. Once they were alone again, Eleanor's expression grew serious. "Marcus, what happened? After you left MIT, you just disappeared. I tried to find you, to contact you. For years." Marcus stared down at the table, gathering his thoughts. "I needed to start over, to be somewhere where nobody knew me as the graduate student accused of plagiarism, where I wasn't constantly reminded of what I'd lost." "You didn't lose it," Eleanor said firmly. "It was taken from you, by Whitmore and a system that failed to protect you." Marcus looked up, surprised by the anger still evident in her voice after all this time. "It doesn't matter anymore, Eleanor." "Doesn't it?" she challenged. "Richard tells me you've been working with his study group, that you solved in minutes a problem that had stumped him for months. That's the Marcus Johnson I remember, the student whose mind approached mathematics with an intuition that can't be taught." Their tea arrived, and Marcus welcomed the brief interruption, the chance to compose himself. After the server departed, he took a careful sip before responding. "The past few weeks have been unexpected," he admitted. "I didn't intend to get involved with mathematics again. It just happened." "Because it's who you are," Eleanor said softly. "It's not just what you do, Marcus. It's how your mind works, how you see the world. You can't erase that, no matter how hard you try." The truth of her words resonated uncomfortably. For 15 years he had tried to compartmentalize that part of himself, to satisfy his mathematical hunger in private, while presenting a different face to the world, but the experience with Harlow's study group had shown how incomplete that separation had always been. "Do you know what happened after you left?" Eleanor asked, changing direction. "With the investigation into Whitmore's accusations?" Marcus shook his head. "I assumed it was dropped once I withdrew." "It was, initially," Eleanor confirmed. "But I kept pushing. I knew you hadn't plagiarized anything, and I suspected Whitmore's motives weren't pure." She set down her teacup with deliberate care. 6 months after you left, another graduate student came forward, a young woman named Mei Chen. She had been working with Whitmore and had evidence that he had systematically appropriated ideas from his students without attribution. Marcus stared at her, a cold feeling spreading through his chest. "What happened?" "The department conducted a quiet investigation. Too quiet, in my opinion. In the end, Whitmore received a reprimand, but nothing was made public. May was persuaded not to pursue the matter further, offered a postdoc position at Princeton to smooth things over." "And my case?" Eleanor's expression hardened. "By then, you were gone. The department was more concerned with protecting its reputation than correcting an injustice done to a former student who had already left the academic world." Marcus absorbed this information in silence, old anger mixing with fresh indignation. Not only had Whitmore stolen his ideas, but others had suffered similar treatment, and the system had protected the perpetrator rather than the victims. "There's more," Eleanor continued, her voice lowering. "Over the years I've kept track of Whitmore's publications. That paper he published after you left, the one that established his reputation in variational methods, I always knew it contained your ideas. But recently, I've been reviewing it for a retrospective volume. And Marcus, the parallels to your unpublished work are unmistakable." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that with your notes from that period, with your preliminary papers and the records of our discussions, we could prove that Whitmore built his career on ideas he took from you, ideas that should have established your reputation, not his." Marcus leaned back in his chair, the implications washing over him. "After 15 years, Eleanor, even if what you're saying is true, who would care now? Whitmore is established, respected. I'm a janitor who never completed his PhD." "I would care," came a voice from behind them. Both turned to find Sophie standing there, a folder clutched in her hands. Beside her stood Professor Harlow, his expression apologetic. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Harlow said quickly. "Sophie was helping me with some research for the symposium and came across something she thought you should see immediately." "What is it?" Marcus asked, torn between irritation at the interruption and curiosity. Sophie stepped forward, opening the folder on the table between Marcus and Eleanor. "I've been researching Dr. Whitmore's work for a project, focusing on the evolution of his approach to variational methods. And I found this." She pointed to a highlighted passage in a recent paper. "This is from Whitmore's latest publication, just released online yesterday. He's extending his original framework to quantum systems." Marcus scanned the passage, his mathematical mind immediately grasping the approach being described. It was elegant, innovative, and hauntingly familiar. "Now look at this," Sophie said, pulling out another document, several yellowed pages covered in neat handwriting. "Professor Harlow helped me access the MIT archives. These are notes from a presentation you gave in a graduate seminar just before you left." Marcus stared at the pages, recognizing his own handwriting, his own notation style.